Here to have a book discussion, may I also call it a book launch, with your permission, a book discussion on Professor S.D. Muni and Dr. Rahul Mishra's book titled India's Eastward Engagement from Antiquity to Act East Policy. And this is a seminal piece of work. I actually went through the book and learned a great deal, even though I thought I knew a great deal about our Act East policy and particularly the Southeast Asian region. The panel that we have today, the eminent speakers include His Excellency Ambassador Sidharto Reza Suryodipuro. As his name suggests, he actually encompasses the entire title of the book, From Antiquity to Act East Policy, because Sidharto, to my mind, speaks of the ancient Buddhist links between India and Southeast Asia. Reza, to my mind, also reminds us of the fact that Islam spread to Southeast Asia through primarily the maritime trade route, in which my home state of Gujarat and the Bora community there also played a key role, the kind of role that they played in countries like the Maldives as well. If you were to go to the Maldives, people will remind you there that the Gujarati Bora community actually played a key role in the advent of Islam and trade in those parts. So the Pacific route that Islam took to Southeast Asia is distinct from the kind of entry into the main part of the subcontinent is seen in his name, Reza, the maritime links with southern India, the fact that we had Hinduism also move from India to Southeast Asia during the ancient Chola, Pallav and the Vijay empires. All this reminds us of our close links with Southeast Asia, and all this is brought out so very precisely and in a well-researched manner in the book. We also have, of course, Professor S.D. Muni himself here, with a very close association with IDSA, and he doesn't need any introduction in IDSA or elsewhere for that matter. Mr. Rahul Mishra, Dr. Rahul Mishra has worked in IDSA till recently as a budding researcher. We also have with us Ambassador Rajiv, Bhatia, who has an extraordinary career in the Indian Foreign Service, encompassing several subjects and regions, and notably having a great deal of knowledge and expertise on Southeast Asia. We have Dr. Professor Pant, Director Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program, Observer Research Foundation, as the other discussant in addition to Dr. Rajiv Bhatia. So today is a very important sort of event for us on a subject that not only touches upon antiquity but takes us to the current contemporary period in which in 2014 India finally switched from a look east policy to an act east policy. And in this we have seen that over the last 70 years our relations with the ASEAN region or Southeast Asian region have had their own limitations as well as tremendous opportunities. If we are to look at our ancient cultural links, the maritime links, the trade links, that's a great deal of sort of infrastructure already in place, carried over into countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, beyond their current sort of political, ideological or religious identity. This we see in the form of the Ramayana and Mahabharata that have been co-opted as pre-Islamic cultural heritage. In Thailand also we see, for instance, the imprint of Sanskrit as elsewhere. We see the imprint of the Rajasthani tunic or the Brahminical attire in the princely families. In the 50s, we are also aware of the gaps between India and Southeast Asia on account of many of them actually participating in Seato and the Cold War divisions of that period. More recently, the ASEAN region, which India engages very strongly, has come to the fore, primarily because it has increasingly, in my view, come under the not only the economic but also in some cases the strategic sway of a rising China. So there is a new kind of normal emerging in Southeast Asia, and this is increasingly acquiring greater salience in the context of the Indo-Pacific construct. Where will ASEAN head? Will it be central to the emerging dialogue on the Indo-Pacific? Will it be ignored? Can anyone afford to ignore the ASEAN countries given their centrality in the cultural and economic context in what's happening in our part of the world? So there are very many issues. There are a large number of speakers. I will simply conclude my initial remarks here by acknowledging the importance of this seminal piece of work and inviting first off Professor S.D. Muni to... All right, it didn't say so here. So we shall then release the book first, and then I shall invite Professor S.D. Muni to give us an overview of the book. Some more copies? How many copies do you have? Okay. So please, sir. Congratulations to Dr. Professor S.D. Muni and to Dr. Rahul Mishra. May I now invite Professor S.D. Muni to give us an overview of his book and to give us the benefit of your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chenoy, for organizing this event. I'm grateful to you and to the IDSA for this organization. In fact, the book was almost half written in IDSA, in room number 6, down on the ground floor. And I'm grateful to the library for the support, particularly Mr. Jhavia. The map department has been very helpful in giving me the map for the book. So it's quite appropriate that the first event related to the book should start from IDSA. I, of course, must acknowledge the cooperation and collaboration of Rahul, who is not here at the moment. He is in Malaysia. And a great effort which Dr. Uday Bhan Singh made in coordinating various other things. So I'm really thankful to you and to the IDSA for this. About the book, I would be very, very brief. And if there are if there is anything which I wish to react, I'll do it later, if possible, in terms of time. The book intends to do or tries to do 3 things. First, it goes and explores the history of our looking east. And that provocation came largely from various things which I used to hear in Southeast Asia, both while I was ambassador as also in academic assignment. And they said, India is not doing enough, India is not looking at us enough. This is a regular criticism of India. And then came President Obama, who told all our parliamentarians that you better start acting east, you are not doing enough, this and that. And then I thought, is it really that we have not been doing enough? And that was one provocation, and that's why I explored into the history. The second attempt which the book makes is that look east is often associated with Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's and particularly Singapore speech. And I have gone into the effort of saying that Look East started much earlier. It has been continuing. And even during Narasimha Rao's time, the real change came with Myanmar rather than with Singapore, where we changed our policy from support to the democratic movement there to the military regime, and for strategic reasons. Because Look East is also known in wider perception as a policy launched by economic drive. And I have argued that economic drive was important, was very much there, but the strategic factor was there. The third thing which the book tries to address or raises the question that Act East policy is not substantially new, mark my word, substantially new from the Look East policy. And we could have done, this is my personal view, we could have done all that we have done under Act East, under Look East as well. But then why the change came? So we have argued and tried to show what were the political considerations or any other considerations which brought the change in the nomenclature of the book. Maybe there are various things in the files which we do not know, but to the best of our efforts we found that nobody, even while talking to some of those in the NEA and others who have been busy with formulating the policy at that time, did not get any satisfactory answer. So these are the three propositions which are main thrust of the book. And lastly, we look at the prospects as to how long this Act East policy continue and in what form. And we are convinced that the policy has been energized in a very significant manner. The present regime has contributed to its thrust and its sharpness. And our engagement with Indo-Pacific, quote unquote, will continue and deepen further. And these are the reasons for that. At some place, I have also tried to go into Indo-Pacific because while researching in various seminars, I found that the Indian ministry, MEA particularly, was very shy initially not to use Indo-Pacific. And the impression created is, oh, this is a Western concept which has been brought to us. The Japanese introduced it to us. The Americans then pushed it up. The Australians pushed it up. And we have traced that it goes much beyond. And this is there even in the Indian official documents, starting with 2004, even Navy doctrine, naval doctrine, which was there, that there are references. Not only that, historically we have already said it goes much back. But even in terms of its present discourse, it was first an IDSA scholar, who is now with the Navy Foundation. What is his name? Gurpreet Khurana, who wrote much before Abe told Indian audiences that we see the confluence of the two seas. This indicated. So it is a concept which is embedded, in my mind, into India's culture and civilization. It is embedded into India's strategic thought from the beginning, and it is embedded into India's economic aspirations and objectives. Therefore, this is a concept we must have initiated. Thank God that Indonesians have supported us very, very strongly, and they have their own interpretation and projection of the Indo-Pacific. But the shying away from Indo-Pacific, and even now there is a lot of, well, where do you define, what is the boundary? We can discuss that later on. So this is also, there is an attempt to explain and to some extent justify that we must stick to this concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Muni, for those enlightening remarks. I now turn to the lead speaker that we have this morning, His Excellency Ambassador Sidharto Suryodipuro. I cannot think of anyone better than Ambassador, if I may call you Ambassador Suryodipuro, to speak on a book titled India's Eastward Engagement from Antiquity to Act East Policy. For your very name actually suggests, at least in a land of sun worshippers like India, that you as Ambassador Suryodipuro Suryodipuro, and I suppose that's actually Suryodipur, a place from where you can actually see the rising sun. So there cannot be anyone better qualified than you to speak of either our Lukis policy, as your very name suggests, or our Act East policy. Indonesia is a very close neighbor of India. In terms of nautical distance, it's only 90 nautical miles away. But I think in terms of our shared values, we are actually closer than those 90 nautical miles suggest. We have relations that are growing by leaps and bounds. We have a comprehensive strategic partnership today with Indonesia, and we think we have a shared destiny in shaping the outcomes in the context of maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific as well. So with these few words, may I invite the lead speaker, Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy, and thank you, Professor S.D. Muni, and of course my collaborator on the panel as well, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia and Professor Pant. And good morning to everybody in the audience. As a student of history, this event, our gathering this morning, is something that I would not want to miss. I have gone through the book, although I have yet to give justice by actually reading it thoroughly and closely because of the short time provided. But I can tell Professor Muni that apart from the book that I received from IDSA, I've also placed some books on Amazon. It is already on Amazon. So it is something that I would want to share with my colleagues within the Indonesian Foreign Ministry. Because history is important in our work. The understanding and the consciousness of the past. It's important to know what are the success stories, to know what are the lessons learned, and it's important to help us in charting our way forward. It's important to know where we succeeded, where we failed, and what were the forces behind it. This book is also important in the context of we celebrating 70 years of diplomatic relations. We have a momentum for strengthening relations within the context of 70 years. So I'd like to see this book as part of that celebration, even though it did not consciously make that announcement in the book, but I think it's still useful to highlight it as part of the bilateral relations. The book itself is not about Indonesia alone, broader than that, but I'd like to see it as part of our celebration. On my part, I'm not making a formal statement. You don't see me with the official statement in front of me, and this being a discussion among scholars. Therefore, what I intend to do is to give a perspective of my personal perspective of how I see this relationship in the 27, 28 years I've been in the Foreign Service. I joined just at the end of the Cold War, at the beginning of the new era. We saw a change of how things, the regional, international system was changing. And with that also, I've been using the term, while I'm in India, I've been using the term of rediscovery of this bilateral relations. If you go through the book, you will see why. It is actually a rediscovery between India and Indonesia. A disclaimer to be made is that this is not, I don't have a formal statement with me. Therefore, if you have any questions about what is being said, please clarify with me, because it may or may not be quotable. But of course, I stand by everything that I say. As we chart our way forward, one obvious fact stands out. and that is geography. Professor Muni talked explicitly and implicitly about the role of geography. And a statement of the obvious is that geography doesn't change, and you don't choose your neighbors. And geography, we talk about topography, we talk about location. For India, it is a country, it is a subcontinent with a particular set of neighbors. It shapes, India shapes, and it is being shaped by its neighbors. Likewise with Indonesia, an archipelago with a broad kind of neighborhood. In our modern history, our immediate neighborhood has ways to exert itself as a reality in foreign policy. Even as leaders, our leaders have broader aspirations. At the beginning, in the 1950s, our leaders, through their collaboration, they managed the Asia-Africa Conference, the Bandung Conference of 1955. Through their collaboration, as well as through their differences, they established the non-aligned movement in 1961. These were the broad aspirations. And the book talks a lot about the role of Prime Minister Nehru, President Sukarno, in bringing together how their aspirations, how they sought to shape the regional and international order, and how subsequently it did not succeed. However, they did leave their marks. Until today, Asia-Africa countries still celebrate the Bandung Conference. Non-aligned movement is still a permanent fixture of the international system. So they have left their marks. But the neighborhood factor matters. So it is no coincidence that India's foreign policy has, since that period, been shaped by its relations with its neighbors. The book talks about its relations with China, in particular the War of 1962, Pakistan, the establishment of Bangladesh, and so forth. It is where geography has exerted itself in shaping a country's foreign policy. In the case of Indonesia, the establishment of Malaysia in the 1960s, the Indo-China wars of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and of course Indonesia's own effort as an archipelago to shape its own entity, its political entity. A lot of the Indonesian diplomacy in the 1950s up until today is shaped by its desire to have a unified country that consists of land and water. Maritime consciousness has always been part of the Indonesian entity. When I grew up, we were always instilled with the idea that we are a country between two oceans and two continents. Australia was considered a continent. Every Indonesian children are instilled with the idea that this is a country of land and water, between two oceans, and between two continents. In fact, according to some theories, the idea of land and water was used even in the 13th and 14th century, during the time of the Majapahit kingdom. And even, according to one theory, in the 13th century, in 1275, the king of one of Java's kingdoms, Singosari, the king wished to have united Southeast Asian kingdoms and entities, to have it unified against the expansionist policies of the Mongolian Yuan dynasty. The thinking has always been instilled within the Indonesian polity. On the part of India, the exertion of geography in its policy also translated into India's establishment of the within the UN system of Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. Subsequently, the establishment of SARC, and also in the establishment in the 90s of the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, IORR. Thank goodness it was recently shortened to IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association. Indonesia joined a few years later. Also in the context of geography, it was the formation of ASEAN in the 60s. It began as the maritime Southeast Asia. It is a fractured region, partly continental, mostly maritime region. It was a strategic region. It was a region of the great powers. It was an effort by the Southeast Asian countries to determine their own future. And it is also this wish that in the 90s, late 90s, formed the ASEAN 10. It was not only a search for a common identity of the Southeast Asian countries, an identity to develop an identity of its own, or put in a negative way, an identity that is non-Chinese, non-Indian. But it is also more than that. There are strategic reasons to build a regional architecture in which initially it was meant to manage its own relations by excluding other countries. So ideas like Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zones. The driver behind that was this is a strategic region and we want to manage our own affairs because outsiders will basically, the tension between the great powers will cause tension within Southeast Asia. The thinking shifted in the 90s, post-Cold War era, when I joined the Foreign Ministry. The thinking shifted. It became that we should engage all stakeholders in our affairs. Other countries should be made into stakeholders. And this is manifested in institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Subsequently, after the Asian financial crisis, the ASEAN +3. So ASEAN plus China plus Japan plus Korea. At the same time, this would of course later on to include India, Australia, New Zealand into the East Asian Summit mechanism. Now all countries have self-centered perspective of the world. Each country would look at the world in their own unique geographical setting. At the same time, in the past 20 years, we have seen that human activities have been moving more and more towards the oceans. Economic activities traverse the oceans. Security interests are on maritime choke points. Human activities are in the ocean in terms of resources and on the seabed. So there is a greater interest for many, if not most countries in the oceans in terms of their prosperity and their security. Their prosperity relies on the oceans, relies on access, and therefore their security relies on these choke points. Southeast Asia does become a key geographic setting for many countries. The thinking about the ocean is also not an old thing. It may exist in the classical sense, but in the modern sense, if you look at ASEAN, actually the thinking, the promulgation of an umbrella concept of the ocean came only in less than 20 years ago. So only at the ASEAN Summit in 2003 in Bali, there was a conscious effort to have the ocean as an organizing concept. At the time the summit came out with the idea of establishing an ASEAN Maritime Forum. The forum itself was subsequently established in 2010. India came out not too long ago with its own idea of domestically it was Sagarmala, that the ocean is key in the development of its domestic economy, and that in the context of the region of Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. And from the Indonesian perspective, it was an evolution. We began with Southeast Asia as our primary concern. Subsequently, West Pacific became part of our primary concern, part of our consciousness of our neighborhood. This is in addition to Australia. And then a more recent, less than 20 years ago, it was the Indian Ocean. So Indonesia itself has over the years developed its own thinking about its neighborhood, which is basically maritime in nature. And this translated into the Indo-Pacific idea in a more recent thinking. However, while the terminology of Indo-Pacific may be around for many years, in fact, some would argue since 1941. One of the favorites of Professor Ghoshal was to mention that it was an Indian scholar that mentioned it in 1941. But as an architecture, of regional architecture, it came about, I would say, in 2004, 2005, when the idea of an East Asia summit consisting of not only China, Japan, Korea, but also India, Australia, New Zealand, was conceived. This was, I would say, East Asia Summit was Indo-Pacific 1.0. So over the years, the major actors have remained the same. India, China, Japan, Australia, and Professor Muni highlighted this in the book. It has evolved into the idea of a quad. But there are notable exceptions over the years. Size and relations among countries have changed, and in fact, change is a constant. You will always have change. The search for regional institutions and the development of architecture, regional architecture, have coalesced around the idea of ASEAN-led institutions. Now, all major countries would support the ASEAN centrality. From my own mind, when we talk about ASEAN centrality, we are actually talking about three things. First is the geographic centrality of Southeast Asia. So everybody depends on access, on the security of the waters of Southeast Asia. Centrality talks about the ASEAN institutions, where ASEAN is the driver of the agenda of all of these meetings, of the ASEAN itself, of the ASEAN++, of the ARF, ADMN++, and East Asia Summit. So ASEAN as a driver of the agenda. And thirdly, ASEAN as a venue for others to meet. So the first ASEAN the first +3 countries, the meeting between the leaders of China, Japan, Korea, took place at the sideline of an ASEAN summit. It was in Singapore in 2000. And this subsequently evolved, split off into its own mechanism, looking to create for, they talked about +3 free trade area and all. Obviously, it is work in progress still. The Quad, or the revival of the Quad, took place at the sidelines of ASEAN meetings. And within ASEAN itself, the Mekong sub-region meetings, the IMTGT meetings, this is Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines meetings, all took place at the sidelines of ASEAN ASEAN meetings. So that's how I would describe ASEAN centrality. People usually only talk about the second part, but if you include the geographical part, then everything makes sense. We also have what is different is the challenges that we face. On the one hand, politics, economics, issues like climate change, food security, energy security, terrorism, financial issues have come into a setting that is more difficult to divide in a comfortable compartment. Things have come together. You cannot separate economic issues from security or even issues like pandemic. It's a fact of life that when that national problem may require resolutions within an international cooperation. So that's a different factor that we have to deal with. Now turning to specifically on the bilateral side, we have the 70 years of diplomatic relations. This is a work in progress that we have to work to strengthen. We are doing so by establishing a shared vision on maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. We have developed this relationship into what is formally known as a comprehensive strategic partnership. Within this comprehensive strategic partnership, we, both countries, committed to make investments in turning this, what is termed as a comprehensive strategic partnership, into a genuinely comprehensive strategic partnership. In truth, sitting here in New Delhi, coming from Jakarta, what I see is that it is easier to look elsewhere than to look to each other. So if you're in Jakarta, you look to Washington, you look to Beijing, you look to Tokyo. Priorities are there, mechanisms are established. And if you are in Delhi, you look to Washington, you look to West Asia, you look to Beijing, Tokyo, and others. Looking at each other does not come automatically. So this would be a process. This is not an event. Having a comprehensive strategic partnership is not like turning a switch. It is something that we have to invest in, something we have to continue to build on. We have to work on connectivity, we have to work on trade, tourism, investment. We have to work on changing the mindset. And in this context, Professor Muni's book, I look at it within that context, the importance of thinking thoroughly into this relationship. Look at Indonesia, understand Indonesia not as an insignificant country. If you are in India, if you are Indian, it's easier to look at China, to look at the US, because that's where size are comparable. The rest of the world seems smaller, perhaps. But do remember that Indonesia is the fourth largest, the country with the fourth largest population. It is actually sprawling wider than India. For you that haven't been to Indonesia, it takes 6 hours to fly from one end to the other. These are points that I need to underline, because to my surprise, Ambassador, even among scholars, sometimes they are surprised to know that Indonesia is almost 6,000 kilometers from east to west. So with that, I'd just like to thank you. I'd like to congratulate Professor Muni for his wonderful book. I'd like to thank IDSA for the invitation. And above all, I'd like to thank everybody in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Suryodipuro, for those very illuminating remarks. You have thrown fresh light on a number of issues of great importance and significance to us. I cannot agree with you more when you said that the Look East policy or the Act East policy is not automatic, and that we will have to all make extraordinary efforts to enhance this kind of a partnership. For me, one of the benchmarks of a successful Look East or an Act East policy will be when one goes to any Southeast Asian country and sees in the hotel that one of the clocks is also set to Indian Standard Time, and not just London and New York or Tokyo or Beijing for that matter. Likewise, the proof of the pudding would be when hotels in India also begin to show us Southeast Asian time. So I don't mean to sound frivolous, but I do think it's emblematic of the kind of consciousness we have of one another, and that we see this in hotel clocks as well. Connectivity you brought out is again of extraordinary significance, and in the Indian context I think our Act East policy will have to be backed not just by the maritime connectivity that we speak of, the strategic partnerships that we speak of, or for that matter are moving in tandem with Indonesia to develop certain kinds of say port infrastructure. I think the place is called Sabang. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think land connectivity is a precondition to any effective Act East policy for India. And with that in mind, we have to begin with, as the Prime Minister himself put it some time ago, with Bangladesh, for instance. We cannot afford to ignore the fact that the northeast of India, that entire swathe of territory that links us to the ASEAN countries, is fundamental and integral to the success of any Act East policy. For you cannot act without connectivity, and you cannot act merely on the basis of maritime connectivity, be it economic, be it strategic or cultural. And it is in that context that we hope to make a success of our Kaladan multimodal transport project. We also hope that the trilateral highway project ultimately between India, Myanmar and Thailand links us to various other parts of ASEAN. The Mekong Ganga project is also a concept which should be able to link us more closely together. So I think that will be the ultimate litmus test for the success of your Look India policy, if I may have the temerity to suggest that, or our Act East policy. ASEAN will remain central to whatever we do with the broader region, for it's the connective tissue and the mainstay of that body that connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Whether India and Japan want to do things together in terms of Japan's enhanced partnership for quality infrastructure and our Act East policy, again, the focus will have to be on the intervening space of ASEAN. If we wish to do something more with the Pacific Island countries, so also it is ASEAN. With these few words, I now invite the discussant, the first discussant for today, Professor Harsh Pant, to address the gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinmay. I also would like to thank the organizers for having me here today. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to come here. But I think this was particularly important or interesting, I would say, and humbling, because Professor Muni has been a teacher at JNU where I studied, and so it's a bit of a humbling experience to be discussing your professor's book, and also the fact that he's so prolific at this age, which perhaps should put some of us into a bit of discomfort that we are not perhaps publishing enough or producing enough. So I think, and also the fact that I know Rahul, who has been my junior in JNU, and he has been one of the most hardworking youngsters I've seen. And so this book is basically a tribute to both of these very, very important individuals, and one who has already laid such a phenomenal benchmark in terms of what a scholar should be, what a teacher should be, and the other who is rising in the hierarchy. So my compliments to both Professor Muni and Rahul. And also the fact that what strikes you the first thing with this book is the fact that you have two scholars of two different generations who have come together and written this book. And I must say this here at this preeminent public institution in the country, that it does not happen enough in this country. We don't mentor our youngsters. So the fact that Professor Muni took time out to publish a book with such a junior colleague should also, I think, influence more of the older generation of scholars, should take youngsters into their wings and perhaps take them forward, because it's very difficult in the Indian context to make a mark if you're a youngster. And it's very, you don't get to write op-eds, you don't get to write books, it's always your grey hair that matters. And I think so those with grey hair perhaps should be helping more the youngsters, and I hope the youngsters sitting here would take this opportunity to push the more experienced people here in the room and elsewhere. Then I think it's very important when we are growing up as scholars to have some kind of mentorship. And that Professor Muni, who has raised a generation of scholars, I think is a tribute, is an excellent ambassador to that approach in both publishing as well as in teaching. So I think this is something that is most wonderful about this collaboration, which I think I should mention at the very outset. The other aspect is that it's very unusual if you read the literature on Indian foreign policy that there has been no book on India-ASEAN relations as a whole. There have been books on bilateral aspects of India and Southeast Asia, but I think if you think beyond Sardesai's book or Michael Brescher's book or even Amitav Acharya's book, there are hardly any books which are written from an Indian perspective on the India-ASEAN engagement or India's engagement with the Southeast Asian geography. And so that is perhaps is also important about the book, that here is a book that gives you this broad sweep. Not many books will give you the Nehru to Modi sweep in one go, and here is a book that does that. And it does that by linking various aspects of this interlinkage that we have between the two geographies. It allows us to penetrate a bit more deeply into some aspects of why certain things did not happen. And it also raises some fundamental questions about our approach as well as the approach of Southeast Asian countries towards India. So I think it's also an interesting book in that sense that, that one of the key claims of the book is very significant. That if the idea is that India was not looking east enough, then the question should also be asked as to what were the Southeast Asian nations doing? And what was it simply India's responsibility that India was not looking east enough? Or was that a bilateral, in any bilateral relationship, it's both sides that work. So it's very important, I think, for us to understand, that, and which this book claims, that that there is a bilateral dynamic, and that dynamic needs to be put into certain context when we are examining this very important relationship of two very important geographies. So I think the fact that foreign policy priorities of Southeast Asian nations is also responsible for the present state of affairs, if you call this a drift, and then I think this is an important vantage point to take the scholarship and the policy engagement on this issue forward. India should also not always be on the defensive, that we are the ones that are always responsible. I think we should also ask our Southeast Asian interlocutors as to what was happening from their capitals, from their side. Why was this drift allowed to take place, if at all? And I think in that sense, this book is perhaps going to start a conversation that can potentially be very useful, because ultimately we need to have very honest engagement, very honest conversations between India and Southeast Asia. And I think part of that honesty would be that let's start engaging, looking, of course, inwards, but also asking these questions from our friends as to why was it that this relationship was allowed to drift. There are, I would raise a few aspects of this book which I thought were very interesting, and perhaps where perhaps the authors leave us tantalizingly close to an answer, but then take a step backwards. And I would have hoped that some of those discussions, perhaps Professor Muni might elaborate later on. But for example, the debate about Nehru's outreach to the region. This is a very interesting, debate. And if you read what the book says, and if you read the literature, for example, from Sardesai or from Michael Brescher, there is a very interesting argument as to what was Nehru thinking and how was his world evolving. And Professor Muni and Rahul both raise these issues in their own way in this chapter on Nehru. But I would have liked to, that examination to be a bit more elaborate given the context of the debate and given the significance of that debate. The idea that, because the literature says, the extant literature says that Nehru's concern for global affairs was something that allowed him to backtrack on some of these regional outreach. Now, that is in of itself an interesting argument, and the authors in this book take that argument head on. But I think there is a need to perhaps articulate going beyond just saying that it's possible that Nehru was very realistic, and perhaps that realism pervaded his sense of what India could or could not have achieved in that geography. But it is important to understand what were the imperatives that were driving it. For example, if we think that the balance of power considerations were not part of the discussion, or were not part of how Nehru was envisioning India's role in the region and beyond, then you end up into this debate about what factors actually were driving this outreach. Because Southeast Asia, from the very beginning, was very sensitive to balance of power considerations because of this unique position that they had between China and America. And I think if India at any point in time disregarded the structural factors, then I think you leave an entire generation of Southeast Asian leaders who would not take India seriously, because they would think that the balance of power does not matter for India. Why should we take India seriously when we are navigating this very precarious balance of power position for ourselves? So I think that is a debate that Nehruvian worldview, we have to engage with the Nehruvian idea, because it's easier to say that Nehru was being realistic. But I think going beyond saying that Nehru was, what were the realistic assessment that Nehru was making in terms of his global vision being something versus his approach towards the region being something. I think we need to disaggregate some of these factors more categorically, and I would have liked to see a bit more of that in the book, and then is there, because this book raises those fundamental issues in the very first chapter. The other aspect which I think is again is raised but not carried forward is this notion of is this notion of the fact that if we are looking at look east and act east, and if we are making this distinction that act east has one very important component being cultural connectivity, then why is it that India could not emphasize on its culture, on the cultural side of this dynamic? Now, there are suggestions in the book in places that perhaps it was post-independent generation of Indian leadership was not very comfortable in asserting the religious or cultural connect because of various factors looking at the domestic prism, and perhaps that's where the Muni government comes in. It has been asserting its cultural connectivity. But I think that is an argument that I think we need to assess, because going forward, and this is a point again the book makes, and that cultural connect is going to be one of the most important determinant of our engagement with the region. Whether the Modi government comes back to power or not, whichever government comes to power in this year and in subsequent years, this connect is something that will continue, because we have now laid the foundations in a manner in which it's very difficult to go back. And I think even when you look at how the opposition parties are looking at India's engagement with the region, or where they have talked about it, they have looked at the cultural connect in a certain way. So they are not going to give up on this point. And that is, it seems to me, a very important point going forward in terms of our understanding of the scholarship on the region. That if we just, because the tendency has been to emphasize look east policy 1, economic, look east part 2, strategic, somewhere the 2 dovetail, etc., etc. But if you throw in culture, what does it do to the bilateral dynamic of the region? What complications it creates, what opportunities it creates? I think that's a question that as scholars of the region, we need to be looking at more carefully now, because now that this aspect has become so ingrained in India's approach to the region. And perhaps that's where the questions about the sources of what is driving this, and why is it that we have been perhaps lackadaisical in our approach. The other point that I sort of wish to emphasize is this Act East, and I would think that one aspect of Act East, while the book cites Obama's reproach to the Indian parliamentarians, it is equally important to recognize that around that time, the structural realities in East and Southeast Asia were changing rapidly. And there were a lot of local voices also that were calling upon India to play a very important role. It was not simply Washington that was asking India to act east. It was the fact that you had countries that are very close allies to India, for example, Singapore. Even Indonesia at one point suggested that India should be doing much more, given that the region is passing through such an important phase of flux. So where is India's voice? Where is India's direction? And I think, Act East, therefore, may not be different, but it emphasizes certain realities that, look, the region is changing, the region is demanding certain actions from India. So by just changing the nomenclature, while it adds, while there has been a great vibrancy and activity on bilateral front, it also in some ways goes to satisfy the bottom-up demand that was coming from the region. That India is perhaps needs to do more than what it was doing during the Look East part of the phase. And so in some ways when you move from Look East to Act East, it's more seamless. You are responding not to the top-down approach, not an approach that, look, India has expanding interests and therefore it wants to be more strategically assertive in the region, but also responds to what was happening from the bottoms up, from the ground below, the demand that was coming for India to act more significantly. So I think it's important to emphasize that aspect as well, that it was not simply being done to cater to a Western audience. It was also being done because many in Southeast Asia were also demanding, which they had been demanding for a long time before, that India's response to Southeast Asia needs to become more proactive. The other point is this this very interesting aspect that I think the book brings out is what do we do with the Indo-Pacific construct? And I think that is going to be one of our biggest challenges going forward. We know that ASEAN itself is coming out with an Indo-Pacific construct, where Indonesia is leading that debate. We know that all other major powers in the region have come out with their own Indo-Pacific constructs, and we know that there are problems in terms of there are divergences in these approaches. So the question therefore becomes that how will India's Indo-Pacific articulation impinge on India's engagement with Southeast Asia? Now we have said that nothing, that Southeast Asia remains at the core of India's regional engagement. But let's also be clear that there are differences in some of the fundamental ways in which we look at the region, in which we look at the role of major powers in the region, and the way in which we look at how we look at the engagement of India in the region. In fact, very recently, Ambassador was in ORF, and we had this very interesting discussion of the role of China. So what do we do? I mean, this is the elephant in the room, and I think unless we get around to thinking more carefully as to where do we converge and diverge in this aspect, it would be very it would be very difficult to think of the larger Indo-Pacific construct and think of it becoming the fulcrum around which the engagement would revolve. I think Indo-Pacific in many ways, again, as we know, is evolving. We also know that given the different interpretations, it will be some time before we reconcile those differences. But I think the conversations that we need to start having with our Southeast Asian friends is how do we look at the region, how do we look at this construct in ways that gives us more opportunities, that throws up more opportunities than challenges. And therefore, when we're looking at, and I was reminded of that discussion because that was a discussion in which we openly talked about the role of China and how we have very different interpretations of that engagement. Finally, I think I would say Ambassador in his opening remarks mentioned geographies and how important a role geography plays. I would sort of like to propose that geographies are also not static. Geographies are also imagined, reimagined, deconstructed, reconstructed. We create our own geographies. We we create our own spaces, both maritime and land. And in that sense, our imagination is the real problem. It's not geography itself, but how we imagine our geography becomes a problem. So what is interesting in the last few years is this ability of India to remap its geography or to reimagine its strategic frontiers. And I think that is a very important point that one should underscore. That for a long time this argument was that, look, this is our geography. So SAARC and Southeast Asia, at the most Indian Ocean region, those are our geographic frontiers. We are constrained by them. On the Western front we can't do much because Pakistan continues to create problems for us. And I think the moment you break that geography, the moment you start focusing on the Bay of Bengal, on the Eastern front, the moment you say, yes, that's a problem, but what can we do with what we have? Rather than cribbing about the problems on the Western front, what are the opportunities that are given to us on the other side? And I think that's what has happened. In the last few years, we have seen this reimagination of our geographic frontiers. We have seen a move towards articulating a new geography. We have seen this move that Bay of Bengal is important for us. This idea of eastward hold, this idea of eastward engagement that flows through Bay of Bengal is important for us. And what it does, it sort of unshackles India. It allows India to connect its northeast to Southeast Asia in ways that we had not imagined before. All the projects that Ambassador Chunwar was discussing earlier allow us to think of Southeast Asia in ways which were not possible before. And I think the moment you do this, it allows India to think of its role in Southeast Asia in very different terms than we have done so far. And therefore it also is a matter of how we imagine and reimagine our strategic geography, our strategic frontiers. And I think as that becomes more ingrained in Indian strategic thinking, we will see this shift becoming more operational. We still can crib about how much, for example, BIMSTEC is doing, what is it doing, what are the operational realities. But the fact is that for the last 4 years, the number of times you would have heard BIMSTEC, you would not have heard for the last decade, although BIMSTEC was surviving for the last 2 decades as well. So I think that change is itself very, very significant in terms of where you want to take this conversation. And to me, as you look towards Southeast Asia, you also have to reimagine your geography. The moment you do that, Southeast Asia becomes central to your imagination. And I think that's a very important aspect of where this engagement is going. And this book deals with what has happened to BIMSTEC and in that conceptualization. I found this book very, very useful. Thank you, Professor Muni, and for having me here. Thank you there for having me here. I have one very, very small quibble, which is that the last line says, India can only continue with its present two-way policy to plead cooperation and coexistence with China. I don't think India at this stage should be pleading anything to anyone, least of all with China. So I don't.
We pleaded in Wuhan. That's.
Yes, so but we should not. I mean, if we did, but and I hope that scholars and policymakers would take the conversation with China in ways that recognizes the strength that India has today, and also acknowledges the weaknesses without actually being in a position either to plead or to somehow make a case that India is somehow inferior to China in the present context. And with that, I would like to end. But thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Professor Pant, for your very insightful remarks. You've covered a very broad canvas, and I'm sure many of these points will get addressed, picked up from the audience as well when the Q&A session follows. I now turn to Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow, Gateway House. He, like many of us, and notably, of course, Professor Muni, has been both a scholar and a diplomat. The author himself has been both a diplomat and a scholar. And so I should say that he, for the better part of his professional career, was practicing the theory, and now he is theorizing the practice as a scholar. But having just returned, as he told me this morning, from a very productive visit to Southeast Asia that included the Philippines, Cambodia and Laos, in the company of Ambassador Lalit Mansingh of the Kalinga Institute, I think you will have a great deal by way of personal observations firsthand. The floor is yours, Ambassador Bhatia.
Thank you very much, Sujan. It's such a pleasure to be back here at IDSA with you as the Director General. My greetings to Ambassador Parto. You spoke so beautifully about your region, Ambassador and Professor Muni and Dr. Pant. Dear friends, I will try to be relatively succinct so that there is time for a discussion as well. I think if I take about 12-15 minutes, that should be perfectly okay. It's a real wonderful occasion to serve as an interpreter for a while, or a go-between the author and the very well-informed audience at one of the country's premier think tanks today. I'm very happy that you chose a date when I was just returning back here, and I'm particularly grateful to Uday, who made sure that I had a copy of the book as I left for the tour. So I was reading this book while traveling in Southeast Asia, and frank confession, I've read it cover to cover, and I would like to help you to understand and perhaps create curiosity enough so that you too read the book and benefit from it as much as I have myself done. Professor Muni is a friend of a long time. I think there is mutual respect, although we often do not agree on many things. And Dr. Rahul Mishra is someone for whom I have deep affection, because when I was Director General at ICWA, we had recruited him and he worked wonderfully well as part of our team. So these are positive factors, but I would still try to be objective, because that is the role of a discussant. I have to begin very much first by complimenting about the design of the cover. I think probably Sage would have consulted the authors. Okay, but it is good. I don't know whether you like it or not. It's attractive. It has multi-hued colors and it's conveying a number of signals. And I particularly liked both the main title and the subtitle. I think we are all struggling as scholars of this region to what name we should call it by. Southeast Asia, East Asia, Indo-Pacific, Asia. There's a lot of confusion. Authors chose something very well, Eastward Engagement, and then they attempted alliteration again by calling it Antiquity to Act East Policy. So congratulations on the very first thing. Then I agree entirely with Harsh. This sets another template of an experienced author and a young author combining together. I think it's not first and second generation, it is first and third generation. There is a missing generation between the two, and probably one of the representatives of that generation would have been here, who was the disciple of, or the student of Professor Muni, and who was the teacher of Rahul Mishra. But it's wonderful to have this blend, and I think it's wonderful. He probably was not directly the student of Professor Muni, if I am not mistaken. Yes, but I do understand that. I think I do very much like to stress that the book is a one-stop shop on the Indian policy towards the East. I would say there have been, in fact, several books, not just on bilateral relations, but even on the region. But now we are talking about a quality book. And I think if all of you have to read only one book to learn about the Indian policy towards the East, this is the one which is here right in front of you. Some people might say that this is largely based on secondary sources. I regard that as its strength. What the authors seem to have done, quite apart from reflecting their own deep original knowledge into the book, they have consulted a large number of existing books by former ambassadors and also respected authors, and they have also backed themselves on the once basic official source, which is the Ministry of External Affairs. And whenever they wanted authentic information, they have gone to the official sources. So this is a new approach. You don't have to keep going to what the Hindu wrote 40 years back, or what Jakarta Post wrote 30 years back. A lot of that has been done by other scholars, and the present one decided, the duo decided, to benefit from that. And of course, on a complete disclosure note, I thank Professor Muni for citing my own book on India-Myanmar relations on more than one occasion. Now, coming to the meat of the whole thing, I think the organization of the book is absolutely superb. 7 chapters, each chapter with subtitles, totally with logical and structured construction. I think it just quite apart from the content, just the form should be a very good template for anybody else who is thinking of writing a book. So I think that should be looked at from that viewpoint as well. Now, fundamental thesis of Professor Muni and Rahul is that there have been 7 waves in the relationship between India and the East. This doctrine of his actually goes back to a paper he wrote many years back, which I read many years back, where he had spoken only of 3 waves, that is the pre-colonial wave, colonial wave, and post-colonial wave. But that was probably because there was shortage of space for a paper. Here they had full play, and they took into account these 7 waves, which is Hindu-Buddhist, and then Islamic, then British and freedom struggle put together, Nehru wave, post-Nehru wave, Look-East policy, and Act-East policy. And this is one point I should express my disagreement with the previous discussant. I think the analysis of Nehru wave is one of the most brilliant segments of this book. I mean, in this day and age, to begin with, to talk with complete integrity and courage about Jawaharlal Nehru's contribution to the foreign policy itself is something commendable. But I think what Professor Muni and Dr. Mishra have done is to educate the present generation. Don't go just by social media, go to history. And I think the authors have brought out very clearly that Nehru, impacted by the previous heritage and by his own experiences starting from 1927 in Brussels, created an Asian vision which he pursued with vigor until he ran into larger global political and economic forces, and until 1962 wounded that vision. But what is also significant is for the authors to point out, and this is totally brilliant, when they argue that what Prime Minister Modi has done in the past 4.5 years or 5 years, in essence, is recapturing the fundamental elements of Nehru's Asian vision. Now this might sound sacrilege to some people, but this is the intellectual integrity at its best, and I think I regard this as one of the strong points of the book. Then I would like to point out how the book presents to you the 3 fundamental drivers of India's engagement with the East. They are not very surprising in the choice, but I think still they are important. Again and again they point out that there are 3 factors: cultural and civilizational inheritance, economic aspirations and compulsions, and thirdly strategic requirements and complexities. And they together, in the context of the evolving Indo-Pacific construct, is really the heart of India's engagement with the East. I cannot share everything with you because I'm sure the authors would wish you to buy a book, and I would very much endorse that wish myself. One more point in terms of strength is, they utter the final word on the distinction between or comparison between look east policy and act east policy. For the past 5 years, we have been all struggling to reach some conclusion. There are people who say act east policy is a brand new policy. Others who say there is nothing new except the new name. These people have, I think, produced the final judgment when they say that act east policy and look east policy, the only difference they have is the quantitative difference. Qualitatively, they are the same because a student of history sees how this whole Ganga of India's eastward engagement, which began about 1,000 years before Christ, has continued till 2018. And they are able to point out how the element of continuity is there. And yet, they are also honest and frank enough, and they do not hesitate to praise the present government by saying that it is not exactly the same. There are new elements. The element of energy, the element of dynamism, the element of personal equation at the political leadership, the element of focus on maritime security, the element of the closer India-US relationship in the past few years. These are new elements, even though the policy fundamentally remains the same as what went under the name of the look east policy. So I think this is a brilliant part where you are getting a very insightful view of this thing. Now, just two more quick things. I think it is important, it's customary for a discussant to point out not so much the gaps or defects in the book, but probably pointers for our young scholars who are sitting here and who are looking for ideas as to what I can do if I were to be working in this domain and where I can work further, inspired by this terrific analysis. And this is where I would like to come in. So I say this offering a very empathetic critique with a view to assist the next generation of authors. First, I would say the authors have been rather kind and generous to India Inc. I think Indian business and industry have failed India's Act East policy. The political leaders have succeeded, the cultural leaders and others and civil society groups have succeeded, but India Inc. is not delivering. The authors point out very clearly that this is the case, but I think they have held back in the hope that Indian business needs to be encouraged rather than denigrated. Secondly, I think authors have been a little less than generous to the role of think tanks in both the regions. I think Professor Muni himself has been part of this. He worked very hard sitting in Singapore, part of the various institutions there, and then here. I think it is important to recognize the role of institutions such as IDSA, ICWA, many other think tanks in India, and many important think tanks in the region. Because without the intellectual capital that they created over the past 25 years, nobody really would have bothered about look east policy or act east policy. And the light or the lamp which is still being carried forward today on this score, the front runners are the foreign policy intellectuals of the two regions. I would also say that there are three specific areas where future scholars can work. Number one, as Harsh hinted, what does the Southeast Asians and the East Asians think of India's Act East policy? I do not have time, but I just want to say that when we had these extensive discussions with our counterparts sitting in Manila and Vientiane and Phnom Penh, I was getting a very different view from the view that is reflected here in the book. This is the Indian view. But there is still a lot of ignorance, there is a lot of disappointment, there is a huge scale of aspirations and expectations. So this is one area where some of you can work on. Secondly, what does the West think of India's Eastward Engagement. It does come out occasionally, but that was obviously not the main intention. But this is something that some of us can work on. And finally, what does the youth of India, the present generation, the 30-year-olds, think of India's East policy is something that also would need to be a lot of exploration. Overall, as I said, in a very frank and sincere manner, it's a great occasion for all of us to celebrate a seminal work, and I have no doubt that it will inspire a whole generation of scholars in future to take this forward. And this is something, this book will be read in the chancelleries of India and the region. It will be commended as an objective analysis in a time when ideology seems to be taking over intellectual integrity in our craft. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia, for your very perceptive remarks. As you rightly pointed out, this is indeed a very seminal work that Professor Muni has come up with. And in some ways, I think I was truly struck by one of the blurbs, a comment which said that Professor Muni brings to his work the intellectual rigor of an academic and the broad, expansive touch of a practitioner. I'm not using the same words, but that's the meaning which came across, and it's therefore not a surprise that you covered so many things, which has enabled today's panelists to comment on various aspects in such depth.